All right, so today we're gonna do some discussion, or we're gonna have some discussion around training splits, and we're gonna try to talk about it through the lens specifically of training frequency. In other words, how many times you train a muscle or a movement throughout the course of a week, let's say. And I want to just start off before I hand it to Ethan with an analogy in terms of how I think many people look at training splits overall and how it can be problematic. So when Ethan and I go to get meals, right, we go to a restaurant, right, and we're selecting foods. Oftentimes, what happens is I will look at a menu and I see the names of an order. So it's like, all right, this is the ribeye, this is the ribeye steak, or this is the shrimp tempura, or whatever it happens to be. And I look at the menu item and I see a name and I see a description and I'm like, do I get this thing or this thing or this thing? And oftentimes what Ethan sees is not that. What Ethan tends to see is not like names of specific meals, but you kind of just see like like a list of a bunch of different foods that you can kind of compile if you so choose to create your own order. And so before I met Ethan, my experience of restaurants was very different because I was like, oh, I can either choose this thing over here, and this thing exists in a bucket, and this thing over here is in a different bucket. I never thought that, like, could I just ask for like some of the steak and maybe some of the shrimp together? Like, is that even possible? And so if this is confusing, the sort of analogous description here in terms of training splits is we oftentimes look at training splits as very fixed things. I can do upper lower, I can do push pull legs, I can do full body 3 times, full body 2 times, and people are presented with all these different names of splits, and they're like, well, what split do I choose? Like, how do I decide, right? What is the best, right? That's the common question that gets asked in this regard. And I think to actually, figure out like what training split is appropriate for you it can be a really complicated, messy thing to go through over long periods of time. And so, Ethan, sort of handing it over to you, I'm someone who wants to kind of maybe remove myself from this position that I'm currently in of thinking about splits in these very distinct buckets. How do you kind of view this from a more like bedrock conceptual layer? And how can people start to think maybe a little bit more intelligently in terms of thinking less in terms of names and more in terms of like concepts and hard objects that we can sort of mix and mash depending on the situation? How can we think about training splits in a more sort of fundamental sort of physics-based way, if you will?
So let's just use the analogy you gave of us going to a restaurant, right? And
Yeah.
let's start where we always start with what's the goal? Okay, so the goal could be pretty, varied in this situation. It might be I just want the most delicious meal possible. It could be I'm looking for certain macros. It could be just kind of a caloric total with sort of just checking the box and having each, maybe protein be sufficient with a total number of calories. It may be specific foods. It may be okay, like I know that I digest these meats and these starches, and maybe I want high fat, low fat. So we start with an overarching, like, what am I trying to get more of? Is it deliciousness? Is it calories? Is it specific food? So the specific foods could be these are the exercises that are available. Like these are the specific exercises I want to do because they suit me well from an orthopedic perspective. They allow me to accumulate a lot of good quality reps and thus get an effective stimulus. The calories could be akin to, say, like the total number of sets that you're doing, or just the sort of total number of work that you're accumulating over a given period, in this case, a workout or a meal. And the deliciousness could be just like, what do you like to do? What's fun for you? It could be, say, the intensity, right? Do you want to uh, train particularly close to failure? or with lower reps, thus, heavier loads? Do you want to train with higher reps and lighter loads? Do you want to train further from failure? Like multiple roads to Rome there as far as getting to that calorie number, but they sort of feel different in terms of how you got there. Maybe you do less sets, closer to failure, more sets, further from failure, high loads, low loads. It's a different flavor for that meal. And
I'm pretty impressed with how you translated that off the
well, you
cuff.
know it was
So
on the spot also because you know that I didn't know what in the hell.
yeah, yeah. Fair play. Fair. I think that all made sense in terms of the translation. So please continue.
Okay, so we have at least, broken down some concepts that are analogous to training here because we've talked about exercises and sets and relative intensity as far as proximity to failure, absolute intensity as far as percentage of one rep max or how heavy the weight is. These are all training concepts. So again, when it comes to training, we have to start with the goal. And again, the goal might just be like you just want to get in there and really enjoy what you're doing. It might be about off the bat, just adherence. I think on this podcast, like while we always, pay mind to that, it's such an individual thing that we have to talk about magnitude more than just kind of the subjective experience, while always appreciating that experience and appreciating practical limitations around getting to a higher magnitude of stimulus. But as far as the magnitude of the stimulus goes, if we just say, like, look, the goal for most people in this case is we want to be more efficient at building muscle mass. We have X amount of resources, time, energy, money to put towards this goal of ours, which is building muscle. And how do we build the most muscle through the lens of training? It's really about doing the highest total workload that we can adapt to. And what makes up that workload is a bunch of reps, each individual rep being the stimulus, and then those reps making up sets, and those sets making up are sort of under the context of a given exercise with different constraints and how much effort we put into that given exercise. And then that makes up the total workout. And that workout makes up some type of cycle, whether that cycle be a 3 day cycle, a 5 day cycle, or most commonly, just because of the calendar we work off of, it's a 7 day cycle. But there are certainly plenty of splits that don't work on a 7 day cycle either. Um, but we need to choose a length of time and we need to choose a time in which to sort of measure that within. So we say, okay, we've picked some arbitrary unit. Like it's very easy, like I said before, to just use a calendar week because our lives kind of revolve around that. If we have a 5 or 6 day work week and our weekends are not exactly the same as our weekdays, and we want to plan other things, social events, we want to plan maybe different like recovery modalities for some people. Maybe they go to the physical therapist someday or massage, or maybe they do a cardio at one gym one day and they train at a different gym another day, or they have a training partner that they need to coordinate with. So a lot of times for practical purposes, the 7 day training cycle, is has that unique advantage, but it's not the only way to go about it. So if we talk in 7 day training cycles, it's just simply how can we set things up within that training cycle to do the greatest total workload that we can adapt to, and how repeatable is that over time? Like, what's the length of time that we need to create the adaptation we're looking for? In this case, muscle mass. Like, is it something that we're going to be able to pick up a difference in 7 days? Likely not. Is it something we're going to be able to pick up a difference in a month? Likely not. It's going to be on the order of months and sometimes even, a year or so. So we might break this thing up into chunks of, say, a few months at a time and just say, how can I organize a training block to accumulate practically the most amount of work in this several month period? And that's really how I think about training volume. Maybe it's several months and it's 7 day cycles. And within that 7 day cycle, I'm taking a bunch of practical constraints into consideration. Maybe it's that 7 day work, maybe it's that work week that we talked about, or the practical considerations of being on a 7 day cycle with the rest of the world. Maybe it comes down to orthopedic constraints. Maybe it comes down to time constraints. Maybe it comes down to constraints like we talked about in the last podcast of where are other things? Where is your sleep? Where is your nutrition? Is it worth pushing your training volume up to a 10 out of 10 in terms of what you could recover from orthopedically if you don't have the calories, the sleep, the stress levels in place to actually benefit largely from that stress? So, and just kind of a macro level, that's how I think about laying things out is how can we design a 7 day period to accumulate as much work over a several month period as is reasonable, to get to this goal of the greatest magnitude of workload or stimulus within that time frame.
Yeah, okay. So that's a really good place to start because oftentimes with I mean, the same thing happens with specific exercises, right? It's like barbell bench press. When people hear barbell bench press, they don't hear exercise wherein I'm pushing a metal object away from me and the chest and the front delts and the triceps are stimulated. They have a very specific picture of what that looks like, and there's an emotional association with that movement. It's not just the physics of the scenario, it's the physics plus whatever layer on top of that people automatically sort of add to the equation unnecessarily. And so in the same sense, it's like when people hear something like push pull legs, it's very difficult, especially with a split, to be able to hear or think about sort of what you're saying in the sense that like we have these sort of fundamental building blocks of the split, and that's what that's like essentially the physics of the split. But then there's this other thing that's sort of attached to any particular name: push pull legs, upper lower, bro split, right? There's also this additional emotional layer. There's also this layer of potentially like dogmatism, right? You see different camps that are like, this is the high intensity crowd and this is the high volume crowd. And so there are all these other inputs that I think get layered onto the cake of the conversation that I think are not helpful. And I think it's smart to first sort of remove those from the equation and just talk about like, okay, what are the numbers here and how do we add things up, and then how do we sensibly just divide these things so that we can sustain training long term. That's kind of how I think about it. So in the same way that someone can say, okay, well, my goal is to gain weight, and therefore, maybe I look up in my, calorie calculator how many calories I need to eat to be in a 200 calorie surplus. I take a guess, I measure out my macros, and then I follow the plan, and then I see how the plan goes, right? But there's basically everything in between me typing in my body weight and my height into the calorie calculator, and then picking the macros, picking the foods, and those sorts of things. So the sort of macros and the foods and the amount of the foods, that's kind of like our equivalent of we have sets, we have reps, we have which exercises, we have which muscles. So then the next sort of question becomes like, okay, it probably doesn't seem like the most sensible thing to have a conversation about this from top down, in the sense that like people will make videos and they'll say, you should train each muscle twice a week. It feels to me more appropriate to be like, what amount of work do you think that you need to do? Like, where is the starting point? And then does it make sense to divide it up, 2 times a week or 3 times a week? Would you kind of agree with that? And then maybe we could go into a specific example with like, I don't know, if you want to start to get down more concrete with some stuff in your training, or if you think more broadly it would be helpful, whatever direction you think is sensible, you take it from there.
Yeah, I do think it makes sense to start with, again, the goal. In this case, if it's, I want to build muscle mass, and we think that the stimulus for building muscle mass, the overarching stimulus is just how much mechanical tension we can accumulate and all the other things, whether it be metabolic stress or damage or whatever sort of stuff like kind of comes along with that or is adjacent to that. We need to do a bunch of work, essentially. And underneath that work, it's kind of like, well, then how do we, how do we go about organizing that to be sort of the most cost effective way to do it? So I could just for reference tell you what my split is now. And it's kind of like a good jumping off place to be like, huh, that doesn't sound like something you could just say really quick, like, push pull legs or like one time a bro split, or like it would be really hard to just like give it a name and just like, publish it.
Yeah.
So I do train on a 7-day cycle. In my mind, when that is a possibility, I think it makes a lot of sense from just like an organization and stress management standpoint. And I do think that's a really underrated thing when it comes to growing something, is basically having consistency and being organized and having a system that is stable enough to take on novel stresses or to adapt. So the 7-day cycle, I think, is really good for uh, spending, setting up things with friends and family. So they know it's like, okay, this Saturday night is our date night. We have this time. Whereas some days in another cycle, Saturday might be an off day or a cardio day or whatever. And also, I think having training partners is a great way to just add a social aspect to, if you're training, in my case, see at least 10 hours or more a week, and that's just like the lifting portion of it. I
Mhm.
mean, I leave to go to the gym at 1:15, and I get home at 5:45 at the earliest. So what do you say, 1:15, 4.5 hours at least. Could be a good 4.5, 5 hour process.
Yeah,
Uh,
and people should know that that includes like commute, right?
yeah, yeah, that's not the
Yeah.
training. That's why I said initially
Yeah.
training time for the week, like the time I'm lifting weights is about 10 hours.
Yeah, 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 yeah.
Could be 9, could be 11, but it's somewhere in that ballpark of 10-ish hours of like actual lifting. But I'm not counting like the warm up during that time. I'm not counting like the commute to the gym. I'm not counting like, mixing up a shake or whatever. But the time that I leave the gym that I work at to the time I get home, and that's not including, again, the meal that I ate before that. It's not including the, supplements that I prepped. It's literally just I left one gym to go to a different gym, and then I got home after that. That's what the process is. Spending that much time by yourself, for a while can be okay, but I think over time, just like adding elements of community to that can make it a lot more enjoyable and sustainable. So you're building a life. I think it's really important if you're someone who, whether you're a competitive bodybuilder or you just have aspirations that are similar to competitive bodybuilders, to understand a lot of getting an organism to grow is just about creating consistency, creating a sense of security, stability uh, uh, for the system. And that as a human being, that requires like a social structure, that requires like being able to schedule other things in your week for most people. So I don't think by any means like everyone should do 7 days. I just think you should greatly consider when you're thinking about growing muscle, just how relevant the totality of your schedule is.
Mhm.
Doing consults, we are absolutely talking about their work life, the number of hours they're working, what days they're working, like what does it look like when they're eating? Do they actually set time aside, or is it just something like that they're doing in between, like during other things. What's the sleep schedule look like? Just the routine really is the crux of what bodybuilding is. It's
Mhm.
building a lifestyle, it's building a routine. So that can be done in other ways, but for me, a 7-day schedule allows me to have the most consistent routine, which is really important to me.
Yeah, which by the way too, I think is a good um is a good point to make in regard to why the question of like what split should I do is somewhat of a non-starter, right? Because like to answer that question, one would need to identify what would make the most amount of sense relative to you and your current schedule and your current goals and how they relate to other people in your life and your job. And so if someone can't even train practically speaking 6 days a week, does it make sense to then say to that person, well, you should, your frequency should be twice a week and you should train each muscle twice a week and you're training 6 times a week? Well, no. So it has to kind of start from bottom up, and as you're saying, with the routine. Okay. So once we've identified in your case this sort of 7 day schedule, revolving schedule, then where do we kind of go from there in terms of your process?
Yeah, so from there, again, I would still keep in mind like how is your life organized? What days do you work on? What days, maybe like do you have access to certain gyms? If I have several gym memberships, like I work at a gym. There's one gym that I lift at primarily. There's one day a week where I train at the gym that I work out of. I'm not saying like this is what you should do. I'm just saying like as you um, as smaller and smaller details become important to you in this process of muscle building, bodybuilding, whatever you want to call it, um, the organization becomes more around like, um, what's available to you and how much do you value those things. So going back to just like the 7-day revolving schedule, I think on paper, having something that has nothing to do with the days of the week, where you're just like, this is day one, this is day two, and then I take a day off and I do day three. It's nice because you always have like the same amount of days potentially between workouts. So it's very consistent in that sort of physiological sense. But I think the sort of hole in that argument is just that, yeah, if there wasn't the world going on around you, having that consistency in terms of there are this exactly this many days all the time between these body parts um, is the most consistent. However, if the world is also moving around you, then it might not simply be that it might not be the most relevant thing in your sort of recovery cycle.
Mhm.
Like even though there are, 4 days in between every time you train chest, that might actually be less relevant than, oh, and I can't, go out on date night with my wife. Oh, or I can't train at this gym on that day. Or I don't have a training partner to train with. I think most of those things overwhelm that consistency and you can just make up for it so easily. So let's say I want to train something twice a week and I train it on a Monday. I can either, and I want to sort of split it evenly. I can go Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, that's 3 days, or Friday, that's 4 days. If it's Thursday, I'm going to have 3 days in between one, and I'm going to have 4 days in between the next time I train it. So Monday to Thursday, I have 3 days. Thursday to Monday, I have 4 days. And let's just make the numbers really easy. Let's say this, wouldn't necessarily be the case, but let's say you're doing 7 exercises. It's like, well, maybe you just do 3 exercises on the day where you have 3 days between, and you do four on the day you have four. So you can still split it up for an even amount of volume. Like it just takes a little bit of thought. Like if you want to be that specific and say, well, I want it to be really consistent, the amount of like stress that I'm recovering from in each cycle. Well, it's just like if you have 3 days between one and 4 days between the next, which will be typical if you train something twice a week on a 7-day schedule. Maybe you bias one day towards more sets, or you bias one day towards maybe something more lengthened bias. Like anything that's just more, you could do a little bit more on the 4-day cycle.
Yeah.
With that being said, I typically train Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. Um, that gives me the weekends off from lifting. That tends to be, again, the time in a 7 day calendar where other stuff is going on, where life stuff happens. Um, the it's just the Monday, Tuesday, the Thursday, Friday, in terms of just the total stress of those 2 days is about the same, maybe a little bit more Thursday, Friday than Monday, Tuesday, because it's like Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday off. Um, but it's just a very, very easy way to look at, and I think a way that a lot of people do. I train 4 days, and also when you train 4 days a week, you find that it leaves you a lot of room to pivot. Like when you're on 5, 6 days a week, if something goes wrong, you need to move a day. A lot of times it becomes, oh, now I got to hit that again in 2 days. Or there's a lot of pressure when things move around, where it becomes very difficult to move a day. Whereas with 4 days, it's just, I find it very, very low stress. So I tend to have long training sessions just with the amount of volume that I do. So that's why I said 10 hours in a week. My sessions tend to be more than 2 hours. They tend to be, 2 hours, usually like almost always less than 3 hours, but usually more than like an hour and a half, hour 45. So somewhere in between that. So it's
Uh,
not, yeah, go ahead.
This does not include pooping time, right?
No, it doesn't include that, or like, usually I'll walk on the treadmill for 10 minutes, just kind of clear my mind. So this is just like start of the first warm-up set to end of the last working set.
Okay. Yeah.
And that's probably pretty normal. If, let's say I would say the average bodybuilder probably trains 5 days a week, and they probably train about an hour and a half per session. So you just add that up on kind of a macro level. It's like 5, 2.5, 7.5 hours there. So for me to train 9, 10, 11 hours a week, as a pro bodybuilder, I don't think that's surprising, you know. So for someone training 6 days a week, hour and a half, that's 9 hours. So it's like I'm doing a pretty good amount of training volume in that week. But I really, really value the concept of just managing stress overall and sort of building your life into your bodybuilding. So that's where that 4 days and having that day, if I needed to pivot, sometimes I'll do the Friday workout on Saturday, or if I'm traveling, it's not hard for me to move one day around. So that's literally why I train 4 days. Is I love that freedom if I need it, and my quality of sets don't seem to decline too much towards the end of that 2 hour session. And I've certainly done five, probably more time in my life than I've done four, to be fair. It's probably like 60, 70% five, uh, you know, um, then what, 30, 40% 4 days a week. So I've certainly tried both. And just over time, based on my size now, my strength level now, my life now, I've just kind of settled on that. But again, I don't think it's the right answer. I just think it's the right answer for me right now in my life. And when I measure the changes over long periods, it seems to be moving in the right direction. So getting to kind of like the nuts and bolts here again, Monday, Tuesday, Thursday, Friday. And this is where it starts to sound funny. It's like, well, what's your Monday? I'll list it in order of most sets. I would say pecs, all things pecs, upper, mid, lower. Front delts go along with that. So it's just two pressing movements. It's an incline pressing movement. It's a horizontal or flat pressing movement. So that's my chest and my front delts there. And there will also be some triceps obviously involved in that as well. But the way I do those exercises, I would say, triceps are pretty minimal in terms of their involvement. And then there are no tricep isolation exercises. So really chest and front delts first. And then I also do some back stuff, upper back. They're both diverging exercises. So it's like a vertical-ish pull down that diverges, and it's a horizontal-ish row that diverges. So, all stuff upper back, tiny bit of lats. It's almost like triceps are to my pressing as lats are like to my pulling here.
Mhm.
And some middle delt stuff. And biceps. So it's the main day for my all of my bicep isolation stuff happens on this day, and half of my middle delt volume happens on this day. And yeah, that's kind of the gist. So let's see if I can say that all in order of most to least. Chest and front delts, upper back, biceps, middle delts, and then a little bit of just ancillary, tricep lat stuff kind of baked in to the whole equation. That's Monday. Tuesday is kind of all things legs. I start off with a calf exercise
One,
and
one, one, one question for you there. So with that, before we jump to day two, day one, let's pick on chest. Are you training chest again at any point through the rest of the week?
yeah, it happens again on Thursday.
Okay, so Monday, Thursday, chest.
Yep.
And let's compare the set volume on either of those days. What does that look like?
So on Monday, I start with incline Smith and I do 2 sets of that. Every set is to failure. Every set is assisted. By assisted, I mean I have a training partner that as the set goes on, they're giving me what I need, just enough to basically get past the sticking point or to sort of overcome the resistance profile of that exercise. And every set ends in lengthened partials. So I just go until stuff stops moving.
Yeah.
So that's incline press, and then I do a sort of horizontal to decline um, Nautilus chest press. So it's 2 sets there as well, same type of deal, partner assisted, keep going until the weight doesn't move off the stack. So it's 4 sets there. And then on Thursday, I do a little bit more of a front delt biased hammer strength incline press. So I don't like poke my sternum way up, but I still get some upper pecs with that. And I do the, kind of standard hammer strength incline press that everyone's seen. It's biases the front delts a little bit more, but obviously still get good amount of pec involvement there as well. And then I do a Nautilus machine fly where the pad is on my elbow. And again, both of those are assisted. The pack deck thing even kind of has like a sort of mechanical drop set sort of dealio built into it. So that's Monday and Thursday as far as pack front delt volume goes.
Okay, so basically, we know on paper it would look like 4 sets on chest split between 2 days each for a total of eight, but the emphasis within each specific movement might be some upper pack, might be some more middle lower, might be training more of a short position thing as in a fly, might be training more of a lengthened position thing as in a press. But ultimately, on paper, what it comes down to is eight total sets, 4 and 4 on either day. That seems fairly sensible to me. Now, just to interject, someone might say, "Oh man, Ethan, 8 sets? I mean, I'm doing 20 sets for chest. 8 sets doesn't feel like it's very many sets." Um, Now I think comes an important interjection to this conversation, which is that we can't talk, we aim to talk about frequency, but you can't talk about frequency without invoking the volume, and then you can't talk about the volume without invoking the reps and the effort and the relative load and the proximity. So it's just like I think this conversation illustrates the importance of being able to understand the relationship between variables rather than just viewing any variable such as a split as like an isolated thing that is floating as distinct from everything else. So someone says, "Hey, if, 8 sets doesn't seem like a lot, I do 20. The response to that might be, well, the 8 sets look a little bit different than the 20 sets, we'll say. Is that acceptable?
Yeah, yeah. Like you said, these are made up of individual reps, and my reps have changed a lot over time. You
Yeah.
know, 12 years old to 32, they've changed a lot.
Yeah.
So yeah, have I done 20 sets? Sure. I've done 20 sets in a workout for sure. I'm sure I've done more than 20 sets in a workout lots of times.
Yeah.
But yeah, in terms of just like the total amount of stress accumulated in the week, how that plays out in terms of different fatigue markers, and then budgeting it. Because there's so many questions that had to be asked underneath that. Like, is it 8 sets for everything? Like, are the pecs the biggest thing you're trying to bring up? Is there something else that might be 10 to 12 sets? And yeah, like pecs are probably on the lower end of volume, but also 8 sets I think is still enough for me to be growing, and that seems to be playing out when you observe it over long stretches of time. Even within that, it's like, how did I settle on the order and which day? Because there's not a single thing there that was by accident. It's like, why is the incline press the very first thing? It's like a very slight incline. It's probably about 15, 20 degrees at the most on the Cybex Smith machine. And that one orthopedically for me, I don't fully grip the bar. I can take a pretty loose grip with my thumbs not wrapped around it. And that feels amazing from not only a joint perspective, but just like the pump and the sort of like sense of local fatigue that I get when I'm done with that exercise. I feel like I could pretty much just leave the gym. Like I feel like if I did, 2, 3 sets the way I'm doing it with the partner helping as needed, and then I'm just banging out a bunch of partials at the end, slow eccentric, pause at the bottom. No rep is really locked out. It's kind of that like Jay Cutler, just constant tension on the pack sort of deal.
Yeah.
That comes first because it's super easy to load. I might have during like a training course where I'm trying to grow and not just maintain. There be 3+ plates on there for 15, 20 reps or so. All really controlled, and the thing can probably fit like 7 plates. So I have a long way to go. And the Nautilus chest press is pin loaded. And when I was doing that earlier in the workout, I had to gym pin both sides of it and put several plates on there. It's less orthopedically sustainable for me, I found. It does have this sort of a arcing down type of motion, so it is sort of like a decline-ish press. And you really have to match your path of motion with the machine's path of motion. And when I start, pinning 3, 4 plates on there, it seems to be a lot. It doesn't seem to be super sustainable. I mean, there's an arbitrary load on the stack. It goes up to 320 or whatever. I'm not saying like as you pin load it, like it somehow becomes different than just putting like 5 plates on an incline press. But just with the mechanics of the machine and my body, that one's a little bit less sustainable. It's also kind of like upper pack versus lower pack stuff. Maybe we'll kind of bias the upper pack stuff. So I put that one second, so I can use less load, and that seems to have played out pretty well as far as just orthopedic sustainability and also just kind of biasing the upper pack stuff there. And also notice that most of the pressing is on that day. So if I was going to get more tricep stuff, it would be there. Whereas the other days, the fly, and even when I do the incline hammer strength, again, I do like the Jay Cutler reps. So I'm not locking out my elbow. That hammer strength has a profile where it's pretty heavy at the top.
Mhm.
So it is very much just kind of front delt, pec focused. And I'm not really trying to lock out my elbows and really fatigue the triceps there. So there's kind of more tricep stuff going on Monday. And there's a reason for that. It's because I trained triceps on Friday. Uh,
Mhm.
and then again, kind of same thing with the fly. It's like amazing motion, but I can't pin that machine based on how it's set up. And I'm pretty close to the stack already. And I've found different ways to use less and less load over time, but I don't want to get to the point where I run out of weight on that machine. So comes second.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah.
that's kind of how some of this stuff is formulated, but every exercise is in a place for a reason. So that's just kind of that's the layout of packs for the week, and everything kind of follows that same general trend where most things are trained twice a week. The volume tends to be a little bit heavier on the day that has 4 days to recover. Not always, but most of the time. And they're organized in terms of total sets by their priority on my physique. And they're organized primarily by a orthopedic from an orthopedic standpoint in terms of like things that might be more provocative with heavier loads tend to come later in the session. And I'm always willing to trade a little bit of stimulus for more sustainability. Because again, it comes down to what can we accumulate over months, what can we accumulate over years. And I think just looking at area under the curve, it tends to be that the setbacks push you way, cost a lot more than just getting a little bit less each session. So kind of the old tortoise and the hare game. There is like an asymmetric risk here where when you have an orthopedic setback, that tends to be something that sticks with you for a long time. The setback tends to be much greater than if you would have just done a little bit less. So for someone who tends to be less conservative by nature and has already shown you that like they have the drive and the sort of the internal motivation to take things particularly far and to break themselves, always erring on the side of less is more, I think is valuable, but you got to know the person in front of you.
Yeah, so I think this is a great example of how everything comes down to what happens to be practical for you. And I think while many people will not have the issue, let's say in your case of loading the Nautilus machine or worrying that you're going to have to gym pin it, and then once you gym pin it, then there's a 45, and then you're going to run out of rooms to put 45. Most people don't have bodybuilder issues in that way, but many people probably have at least in principle, similar things, right? So, like, you go to this gym on this one day and this gym on the other day. Are you really gonna like, tie yourself in a knot over like doing this exercise on this day and this exercise? It's like, no, it's like all this stuff is just kind of meant to be moved and crafted to whatever your liking is. And if you don't know what you like, and if you don't know what problems you're running into, well, then you simply just have to kind of take a guess and just roll with the guess. Like ultimately, the only reason you've gotten to this point is because you've run into the problem of not being able to load this machine more. So you're like, huh, what's a way that I could load this machine a little bit less or require myself to not need as much load? I could do this other exercise before this one so that so that I don't need to use anymore. And I just feel like so much of the time we view this kind of question of the best split or how much volume or days between sessions or what exercise as like a very hard technical science, as if we could just sort of crunch the numbers like it's a physics equation. But there's kind of like this proof in the pudding where you look at so many different bodybuilders and you look at a Dorian Yates versus a Jay Cutler or like a Phil Heath, right? And you see all these different strategies, you see all these different opinions, and the only thing to come away from it with is like, well, clearly all this shit can work for all these different people. Might it seem the most reasonable that I would just do the thing that just kind of, you know, fits into the round hole of my life just perfectly nice. And I feel like for me personally, because as you know, Ethan, I'm not like pursuing any kind of goal outside of just maintaining what I've built up to this point, like be giving myself room to kind of be creative in the gym, figure things out, answer questions that people are asking, figuring out ways to turn it into content. So my split is almost set up so that I have that wiggle room within each session where I'm not actually tying myself to specific exercises, but I might tie myself to like a category. So for me, it's like, okay, on my Monday, I train um, push pull, and I categorize that more specifically as um, upper pecs plus lats. Um, and then on my second push pull day, which is on Thursday, I have lower pecs plus upper back. And so I kind of have some specific guidelines there, but I've not tied myself to an upper back exercise. I'm not in the same way that you have been very specific and precise about your descriptions. I'm kind of on the other end of the spectrum where it could be a cable pull down, it could be a machine pull down. If I'm traveling, it has to be this other pull down, and that is actually supplement. It complements what my goals are in that like my goal is to create content in some way or another, and like filming the same exercises every week and reposting the same video of the same exercise is just not gonna it's just not gonna do it for me. And so someone from the outside might see that and be like, oh, Ben, like you don't have this consistency between days. And it's like, well, this is like how the training is supplementing what I'm trying to do. And so don't mistake what Ethan is saying this is to the listener, as Ethan is suggesting that you should do what he's doing. If anything, it's almost the opposite, right? If anything, that's his detailing of these specific scenarios is to illustrate how specific to him each of these things are, and how you, the listener, figure that out in terms of actually developing that skill set. It just there doesn't seem to be any kind of specific roadmap to doing that, right? Like Ethan, before we were recording, you were kind of talking about how it's not really something that you can look back on and be like, oh, this is exactly why I made this change, and like this is something that I can extract and tell people. It's more just like you have to kind of detail out the specifics and then pull from that the principle of, well, in this decision, or in this specific case, I made this decision because of this, but you can't, that's not necessarily something that's generalizable. Um, so the one other thing I wanted to ask you directly, Ethan, was, you said most muscle groups for you right now follow the 2 times a week frequency, um, which would imply that there are muscle groups that do not follow that. What are those muscle groups, if any, and what has been the rationale around the 1 time a week or the 3 time a week, if those are the options that I'm thinking of? What's sort of behind those decisions?
First one, tibialis.
Okay. Yeah, for
Here,
anyone who doesn't know, the front of the shin muscles.
yeah, yeah. So do a lot of calf raises, but I only do 2 sets a week of the tib raise.
Right, you decided two was sufficient. Two was checking the box.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, you just got to throw something against the wall there, take a guess. It's like I don't know what I do, like maybe 10 or so sets of calves a week. And it's just like, yeah, if you had to throw something against the wall and say, like, what's a sufficient amount of the other side of the joint to train that, like, sort of kind of would matter. Two feels like the right number.
Yeah, I'm with you on that too.
It's
Two
not
is
like
good.
based on that. It's just kind of, when again, like you bring up guys like Dorian Yates or kind of like the um, low training volume, low set approaches, and you look at sort of the curves and the meta analysis of like how much benefit do you get out of adding more sets. It's like get a lot of benefit going, from from theoretical 0 to 1, and a lot of benefit going 1 to 2, and then what does that curve kind of look like? So I'm getting a lot of return on the investment if it matters, doing the 2 sets there and just
Yeah.
do much more. Um, but no, the other one would be my quads. So it is actually something that I'm focusing on a little bit more in my current training cycle, which is because I know some other bodybuilders that face this issue. Like they're really large through most of prep, but in order to get down to the level of body fat where I would have like striated glutes and really dug out hamstrings, what happens when I get to that level of body fat is my quads tend to really like flatten out and go from really round and kind of bubbly looking to really stringy looking. So one way around that would theoretically be anything from just like the length, the duration and intensity of the diet to cycling of the diet between, high days and low days. So essentially just umbrella of stress management via nutrition, and just taking kind of a cyclic or sort of auto-regulated approach to the thing and just making sure you don't dig too deep of a hole that you can't pull yourself out of. If we're not talking about losing muscle, but just kind of losing fullness, glycogen, fluid storage, that kind of thing, these are things that can probably be managed on a day by day, week by week basis in prep. So essentially, just getting better at prepping is probably one of those things. But also, the more muscle you start with, the more you can lose. So I'm relatively balanced all the way around, but the more tissue that I can put on things on the most lateral parts of my body, be it the delts, be it the lats, be it the lateral quads, the essentially smaller my waist is going to appear. So those tend to be the things that I focus on more or less is like, can we bring the quads up? Can we bring the lats up? Bit of delts as well. Just try to create a wider overall look from the outer parts, giving sort of the appearance of a narrower silhouette or midsection. So with that being said, you would think training volume on quads to accommodate the higher sets, you would want to split into multiple days. And it's something that I've experimented with. And I think, my injury history, much like many lifters, vulnerable places, shoulders, knees, low back, these are kind of common spots for any lifter. And I just found from a low back and knee perspective, that area under the curve in terms of just sets I could accumulate over many months, it seemed to be much more sustainable doing it one time a week with the way that I train. So it just felt like, I think one thing to consider is that from a stimulus perspective, we're trying to stimulate muscle growth, whether that be contractile tissue or the quote unquote sarcoplasmic or sort of other stuff that grows. We want to make the stuff in and around the muscle sort of appear larger. But with that, we are also creating stresses elsewhere. We are creating cardiovascular stresses and we're creating hepatic stresses. We're also creating joint stresses. And what are the tissues sort of within the joints? What are we're stressing, bone as well. And it's like, okay, we have these different tissues that don't all necessarily adapt at the same rate, whether that be bone, tendon, cartilage, versus, muscle tissue versus these, versus contractile tissue, or yeah, skeletal muscle tissue is the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Uh, we have to take into account that they're not all going to adapt at the same rate. And as we're able to use more load, that might also factor into the sort of total magnitude of time that we need for those tissues to recover. So we might not be looking at the same curve between beginners and between, quote unquote advanced, or between weaker and between stronger people. So it might be that muscularly you could recover in a few days, but it might be in order to adapt bone, in order for the vertebrae to adapt from the axial loading or the compressive load, that might be a 5-day cycle. So even though you may find week after week, 3 or 4 days, that's all you need to get stronger, and you're making those neurological adaptations, you're making the adaptations at the level of skeletal muscle tissue. Now, all of a sudden, 3 months later, maybe the bone didn't adapt, and now you have a new problem. Maybe now you have an end plate fracture and a disc bulge. And so, what's happening at the level of collagen? What's happening at the level of bone? And that's not something that you're not necessarily detecting in those short cycles of a few days between training sessions, but it can be something that's accumulating in the background. And unfortunately, you might not know until you run into a problem. And some people may never run into a problem. Some people might not ever become strong enough where they are sort of crossing that tipping point, or maybe they were just blessed with the right genetics so that though whatever given tissue is just not bearing a tremendous amount of stress. Maybe maybe it's the adaptation rate of the tissue for them, but maybe it's also just their structure. Maybe it's their limb length. Maybe it's the shape of their vertebrae. Maybe it's the thickness, like of their vertebrae, or the width of it. Like all of these things come into account as far as the adaptation rate of a given tissue. Also, obviously, the nutritional recovery, all those other factors. So when you're taking that into account, again, it just kind of comes down to personal experience. There is the style of training that I do, the proximity of failure, the exercise selections. And when all those things come into play and you sort of dial things up and down, you find, no matter how I arrange this, it seems like I can do more over several months, or I'm less likely to, again, run into that situation with the hare, versus the tortoise, where you have to just make repeated stops along the way. Sometimes it's just about finding the program where you have to make the least amount of stops that is enough that you can do for an extended period of time. So I put all two, four, seven, 10 of my quad exercises on Tuesday,
So 10 total sets across
one
uh,
day.
one day. Okay. And so that's pretty much, those are pretty much the only two groups, the quads and the front shins.
Yeah, it's really just quads.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, that sustainability bit is the biggest part. And I think to extract from that, and it seems kind of obvious that we have connective tissues, we have bone, we have ligament, we have tendon, we have the actual synovial structures, right? We have cartilage inside our joints that needs to recover, but these are things that we don't really remember. We don't really remember that these things exist until there's a problem in any one of them. And then all of a sudden, once we identify a problem in one of them, then we basically, craft a narrative about whatever we think happened to have, gone wrong along the way. Maybe it was like, oh, I woke up, I slept on this poorly. It's like maybe you slept on it poorly, or maybe it was just these like very minor sort of steps beyond capacity that then accumulated up for long enough to where you were to experience a symptom. And I think honestly, I feel like it's in many cases it can be quite obvious, like what kind of issue you're experiencing. So like if you imagine two kind of categories, one category is like, I do this exercise and it hurts my elbow, but then like, I change the direction of the cable or the placement of the cable, and now my elbow no longer hurts. But then there's kind of like this other thing in this other category, which is more like my elbow didn't hurt on day one or day seven or day 14 or day 21, but by the end of the month, it's starting to be like a little achy. There's nothing I can acutely do to make it feel better. If those are two categories, I think that the second category of problem is harder to develop probably, but also harder to then resolve. And I think a lot of times those kinds of issues, the sustainability issues, they need to be solved on like a more of a global level. Doesn't mean that the micro doesn't affect that. Of course it does. Um, but I think a good heuristic might be that you should aim to make every rep as sustainable as possible for the longest time period as possible, rather than looking at it as like, oh, just because this doesn't bother me now doesn't mean that it won't ever, bother me. So, the person who does barbell triceps skull crushers might not have any kind of discomfort on day one, but by month one or month two or month three, to me, it seems obvious that there's more of a, we'll say, connective tissue consequence to doing that kind of movement as compared to something like a single arm cable triceps extension, where you can make it hyper specific to the path of the elbow and the comfort in the hand and the forearm and all that stuff. So somewhat of a tangent there, but I think it's just interesting to see how you can start from the concepts about training split, and then you touch on frequency, and then you touch on volume and exercise selection. And now we end up at this conversation around sustainability, which to me kind of seems like it's almost the thing that underlies all other things, is like, is what I'm doing sustainable? And there may be many people who are not training that much, using that much volume, that much effort, who may still have pain for other reasons, right? But that or discomfort for other reasons, but that may be, due to a whole bunch of other things that might not have anything to do directly, at least, with training or with the topics that we've discussed today. So, um, in terms of just sort of tying a bow on all this, in terms of just sort of summary and conclusion, I think a sensible takeaway from today would be something along the lines of try not to think too categorically about how you're setting up your training. Try to think more in terms of, how much you think that you need to do based on what your goals are and what your experience has been, and then working backward from there in a way where, to take your chest example, it makes sense in terms of the time between days. You're giving yourself enough time for not only the muscle, but then longer term for also the sort of connective tissue. And I think that if we land on, a 1 to 2 week frequency for most muscle groups for most people most of the time, I think that's at least a sensible place to start. And then you can kind of change things over time. If you feel like you can do more, you can try that. If you feel like you need to pull back, you can try that. But just understanding the sort of squishiness of the structure, as being the most important thing rather than any kind of rigid boundary between splits. Is there anything that you would add, Ethan, to that, just to kind of wrap things up?
I think you summed that up pretty well. You mentioned earlier just observing broadly what successful bodybuilders are doing. And even in the research, there are studies that are just survey studies of like natural bodybuilders and enhanced bodybuilders too, and just saying like, how, what's your training frequency? And again, the average is about um, 5 days a week, not like per body part, but, just 5 days out of seven that they're lifting. And actually, it's still most common for people to train each body part once a week. That's still
Mm.
the so I think it's important to just realize like that has been permissive of progress for all, for every bodybuilder, right? Like, it's been varied. Like even Ronnie mostly trained each body part about twice a week. Obviously, it was sustainable for his career, but not so much after the fact. When you combine, how strong he was, obviously there were some consequences. Not saying that the twice a week is what caused that, but clearly just the total magnitude of all of it across that many years, and whether it be the exercise selection, the execution, the total amount he was doing. When you just add up all the things, you obviously cross the tipping point, somewhere. And yeah, just broadly, like, do you see many bodybuilders training body parts less than once a week? No, we don't. Has once a week pretty much been permissive of plenty of, Mr. Olympias, both, in the natural realm as far as like, on the national competitive scene, and in the enhanced realm? Yes. Are is it also not uncommon for people to train things 2, 3 times a week, totally, even if they don't know it? Sometimes it's just like we mentioned with the pressing stuff earlier. They're still doing some triceps, pulling stuff, still doing some elbow flexor stuff. So probably one to, like you said, 2, 3 times a week, somewhere in the middle. If you're pretty new to lifting, twice a week is a pretty reasonable place to start. That's kind of where you end up with these like push pull kind of splits. So, if you are newer to it, you kind of just shoot the middle. If not, start with where you're at. And as always, you're just starting with where you're at and just kind of modifying out from there. You just start with the why. If there's somewhere where you want to attempt to do more, just ask yourself, well, how could I arrange that? It might simply be that, well, if I took the exercise that was last in my session and moved it to first in my session, not by rearranging that day, but just by moving it to another day, where now all of a sudden it's not maybe hampered by another exercise before it. That might possibly be a way, to get more total work done in the week. And like we've talked about before, can you measure that? Like the most recent meta regression on this subject of training frequency, which was also built in the training volume one, is going from once to twice a week training frequency as it relates to hypertrophy may be beneficial. It's not like entirely clear, it's not huge magnitude, but maybe there's something there. And then anything, 2 to 3 and above seems to be, much less, of an impact. So it doesn't seem to get worse. That's important to note. Like going from 1 to 2, 2 to 3 doesn't seem to make things worse. Um, but that doesn't, you again ask what the average length of the study was, which just off the top of my head, I think it was about 8 weeks, no more than 10 weeks, which is less time than those training cycles I was talking about, and of several months, and certainly less time than what it would take to see progress in someone who was like intermediate to advanced on a level that you could see. So even if, 3, 4 times a week isn't worse in the research, does it fit into your life? Is it orthopedically sustainable? If you check those boxes and it's working for you, then carry on. If not, then just know that moving to a lower frequency, even if it is just, once a week, has been perfectly workable for plenty of successful bodybuilders in the past.
And if you don't know where to start, you can go to modernmeathead.com and you can buy a fucking $10 PDF program. How's that? How's that for a starting point? All right, everyone. We'll see everyone next week, I think. And I hope everyone has a fantastic week. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, requests for future podcasts, send me an email at modernmeatheads@gmail.com. And we'll see everyone next time.